Section 13, Administrative Enforcement. What happens after a fair housing complaint? Arizona Fair Housing 101. The phone call no agent wants to receive. It had been several months since Sarah completed her first fair housing training. She had become more confident with every transaction, carefully applying the lessons David had taught her. One Monday morning, her phone rang. "Hi, Sarah. This is David. Can you stop by my office for a few minutes?" Sarah immediately became nervous. "Is everything okay?" "It will be. I just want to go over something with you." A few minutes later, Sarah walked into David's office. He handed her a letter. "This isn't about one of your transactions," he said, "but someday it could be." Across the top of the page were the words, "Housing Discrimination Complaint." Sarah looked concerned. "I've never seen one of these before." "Most agents haven't," David replied. "But every licensee should understand what happens if a fair housing complaint is ever filed. A complaint does not mean someone is guilty." David explained that one of the biggest misconceptions in real estate is believing that a complaint automatically means someone violated the law. That's simply not true. Anyone who believes they have experienced unlawful housing discrimination may file a fair housing complaint with the appropriate enforcement agency. Filing a complaint begins an investigation. It does not automatically mean discrimination occurred. The purpose of the investigation, David explained, is to gather facts. The investigators don't begin by assuming either side is right. They begin by collecting information. Sarah nodded. "So everyone deserves to be heard." "Exactly. The investigation begins." David explained that after a complaint is received, the appropriate agency generally notifies the respondent, the person or organization accused of discrimination, and provides an opportunity to respond. Investigators may request documents, emails, advertisements, policies, transaction records, contracts, or other information relevant to the complaint. They may also interview buyers, sellers, landlords, tenants, witnesses, brokers, and other individuals involved in the transaction. The goal, David explained, is to understand what actually happened, not what someone assumes happened. "Documentation matters," Sarah asked. "What if the agent did everything correctly?" David smiled. "Then the transaction file often becomes your best friend. Well-documented files can demonstrate that every client received consistent treatment. Showing logs, emails, notes, advertisements, MLS reports, written policies, and transaction records often help investigators understand the sequence of events. One reason brokers emphasize documentation, David explained, is because memories fade. Good records usually don't." Professional cooperation. Sarah asked another question. Should someone ignore the complaint if they know they didn't discriminate? David quickly shook his head. Never. Licensees should cooperate with lawful investigations while also notifying their designated broker and, when appropriate, obtaining legal counsel. Professional cooperation helps the investigation move forward while protecting everyone's rights. It isn't about arguing. It's about providing accurate information. Why office policies matter. David walked over to a filing cabinet. Inside were dozens of office policy manuals. "See these?" Sarah laughed. "I've never actually looked at most of them." "You should." Consistent office procedures often become one of the strongest defenses during a fair housing investigation. Policies requiring every buyer to complete the same intake form, using identical showing procedures, providing every client with the same information, following standardized advertising practices. Each demonstrates that the brokerage applies its services consistently rather than treating consumers differently. The policies protect the brokerage, but they also protect the individual agent. Most complaints never reach a courtroom. Sarah looked relieved. "I always assumed every fair housing complaint ended in court." David smiled. "Fortunately, that's not how most cases work. Many complaints are resolved during the investigative process. Some are dismissed after investigators determine there is insufficient evidence of a violation. Others are resolved through voluntary agreements between the parties. Only a relatively small percentage continue into formal administrative hearings or litigation. That's what we'll discuss in the next chapter." Sarah smiled. "So today's lesson is really about understanding the process." Exactly. The more you understand the process, the less intimidating it becomes. The best investigation is the one you never experience. As Sarah prepared to leave, David offered one final piece of advice. You can't control whether someone files a complaint, but you can control how you conduct your business every day. Treat every client consistently. Document your transactions. Follow office policies. Continue your education. Ask questions when you're unsure. If you do those things consistently, David said, you'll greatly reduce the chances of ever sitting across the table from a fair housing investigator. Sarah smiled. "I think that's advice every agent should remember." I couldn't agree more. If you are ever notified of a fair housing complaint, immediately notify your designated broker. Do not alter transaction records, delete emails, text messages, or advertisements. Preserve your documentation, cooperate professionally with the investigation, and seek legal guidance when appropriate. Honest documentation and consistent business practices are often your strongest defense. Online discussion. Question 1. Why does filing a fair housing complaint not automatically mean a violation has occurred? Answer. A complaint simply begins the investigative process. Investigators gather documents, interview witnesses, and evaluate the facts before determining whether a fair housing violation occurred. Question 2. Why is documentation so important during a fair housing investigation? Answer. Well-maintained transaction records help demonstrate that the licensee treated every consumer consistently and complied with brokerage policies and fair housing laws. Question 3. What are some examples of office procedures that help reduce fair housing risk? Answer. Standardized client interviews, consistent showing procedures, objective advertising practices, equal follow-up with all clients, and thorough transaction documentation all help demonstrate consistent treatment.